Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. Good afternoon. With us is, as always, to talk all things livestock markets is University of Missouri's Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Some positive news. Maybe it's grasping at straws to call it positive news, but some better news than we've been having in recent weeks. And we'll get into a lot of that as we get going. But to recap and to start things off, let's take a look at what happened this week in the markets.
Definitely start on the cattle side as always. Cash fed cattle are about $4 higher this week. Those feeder cattle auctions were anywhere from $1 to $8 higher for the week. The futures market saw good increase this week with the June live cattle futures contract up more than $7 and the August feeder cattle futures contract up $9.25. The choice box beef value continued to skyrocket, up nearly $93 over a week ago, with strength across the board and all those components. On the pork side, ground gilt prices were a little more than $8 higher this week. The June lean hog futures contract closed down a little more than $1. The pork cutout value also went up this week, up nearly $20 on the week.
So I think one of the things that we've been talking about really as we get into and we finish talking about the week in the markets is what's been going on as it relates to slaughter capacity and processing pressure that we've been seeing. Kind of an uptick this week, and I'm hoping maybe we've turned the corner and we're starting to see more facilities be able to come online and at least run at maybe a slower chain speed, but still going.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at what USDA gave us today, it looks like about 328,000 hogs will be slaughtered today and 85,000 cattle. Looks like we have a pretty good run of hogs slated for tomorrow on Saturday at 226,000. When you look at the week as a whole, cattle slaughter for the week up 6.4%, hog slaughter up 15.3%. I sure hope, Megan, we've gotten to the bottom and are going to continue to climb our way out of what's been a much weaker processing side of things. Just to put this in perspective, even though we got an increase this week relative to a week ago, cattle slaughter is still down 32% relative to a year ago this week, and hog slaughter down 24% relative to a year ago. So still a ways to go yet.
Scott, as we talk about that, how critical, if this is really us turning the corner and starting to increase our capacity, is it to helping us improve cash hog prices, improve maybe some sentiment and feelings about both the cattle and hog industry right now?
Yeah, so I think it is important. To me, it has been the bottleneck that has really pushed, if you will, at producer prices lower and wholesale prices higher, as we've struggled with just the sheer volume of cattle and hogs that are now backing up that we need to deal with. So getting back to more normal slaughter capacity, and I'm not even saying we get all the way back to normal, but just getting closer back, I think helps us. The last thing we want to do is do things like euthanizing hogs, which we know has been happening in some cases. So it's nice to see us move in the right direction. I just hope we continue to improve. I know there's a lot of stories this week about grocery store shelves that are sitting there empty. I hope if we continue to see some building that in terms of slaughter numbers as we go into next week, that'll quickly start to reduce the empty grocery store stories that we're seeing out there as we get more supplies on the marketplace.
And we've really seen, we had a story on Brownfield earlier this week talking about Kroger, Hy-Vee, which are both more regional food chains, Costco, who's a wholesale supplier, and even Wendy's putting restrictions and in some cases not having beef available. What does this do to the whole, domestic demand situation when we're showing, and there's not necessarily a shortage, but there's a disruption getting the food where it needs to go? How does that play on the domestic demand situation, consumer sentiment, and those types of things that we're really relying on to make sure the domestic demand remains strong?
Yeah, so I think in some ways when you think about that whole dynamic of consumer demand for meat, I go the last thing you want is consumers to be thinking about switching right now. And so if they don't have meat as an alternative and they were to shift to some other protein source, and all of a sudden they say, oh, that's really good, and make that shift longer term. We don't need that happening right now. I think we're setting ourselves up for some higher retail meat prices for consumers that are going to be hard enough for them to swallow with what's going to be falling income. So we don't need on top of that any kind of real shift in demand. I think that depends a lot on the consumer. Some consumers are going to be more than happy to be back in the meat eating business, and I'll put myself in that category, while others might have already been looking at those alternatives. So I think it only accentuates in some ways those consumers interested in maybe some meat alternatives might make that switch more permanently. But we do need meat cases to be full, and we don't need consumers to be making different choices.
Does it potentially highlight and maybe find some additional support for those regional processors, maybe smaller facilities, local, in connecting consumers with farmers to pick up and support local farmers and beef and pork producers?
Yeah, so I think it does. Now, I always like to remind us that we're likely not going to find that local outlet, one that replaces commercial production. When we talk about making the runs and hogs that we do on a daily basis, it takes a lot of small operations to even have any hope of putting a dent in overall numbers for a day. However, I do think you are finding consumers who are more interested in connecting to that local farmer. So those producers that are set up for that, I think it offers an opportunity for a stronger relationship to be developed longer term. I think even there, though, we're having a problem finding shackle space in many of those local smaller processors. I keep hearing many of them booked up July, August, even further out. So the backup that we're seeing, it's spilled over already into those local markets. But if I was in that local business, this is an opportunity to really market my product as a reliable supply longer term for consumers.
All right. So I think probably the best news that we're going to talk about this week is the global trade picture, specifically as we take a look at the USDA's monthly trade data for March.
Yeah, so we got great news for the March data. When we look at it, we'll start with the best news first. On the pork side, you'll look at fresh and frozen pork in March, almost 244,000 metric tons out of the United States, a little more than 40% higher than where we were a year ago at this time. Shipments to China certainly jump out when we look at the pork side. Nearly 70,000 metric tons of the exports went to China. In percentage terms, that's an astronomically large increase in China. So we're beginning to see some of what we anticipated, perhaps with a phase one agreement starting to happen. Even on the beef side, up again, March set at about 88,000 metric tons of beef exports, not quite 8% above where we were a year ago at this time. For me, the very good news on the beef side of that equation, though, is Japan. Japan was up 25%, or U.S. beef exports to Japan up 25% relative to a year ago. So some really good news on that export side of the picture.
As we talk about the China situation, how much of that is phase one? Does it also encompass a lot of the African swine fever concerns and the shortage that they have there? And is this a good sign for us to continue to be able to move more pork into China?
Yeah, so I pick all of the above relative to the suggestions that you gave me today. I think it's related to phase one. It's partially due to the fact that African swine fever continues to be an issue in China, and so I think all in all, we can look at the remainder of 2020 and say, I think we're going to have the opportunity to export a lot of U.S. pork products to China as we finish 2020.
How important is this demand nugget to the overall picture for U.S. beef and pork producers?
Yeah, so I think it's very important. If you look at the graph here that I've got for you today, so this is first quarter exports compared to first quarter production for 2020. If you take pork, just to make the point, nearly 100% of the increase in pork production that we saw in the first quarter of 2020 was exported. And so we didn't have to grow a lot of supplies on domestic markets. All else equal, I think it helps, even in the case of both beef and chicken. We're talking about double-digit portions of the growth in production that left the U.S. I think all that's helpful now. I sometimes we have this discussion in the middle of what's empty grocery store shelves in this country, and I just remind everyone that that'll change. That has a lot more to do with the processing bottleneck in terms of getting these domestic supplies to our consumers here in the U.S. We're talking about growth in overall production the first quarter in all three of these meats, and it's important to be able to get a portion of that additional production outside the United States.
Scott, as we continue our conversation, really, it's great to have some good news, some bright spots for us to talk about this week. I think, sadly, we're going to end on a more negative note as we take a look at the jobs report, which came out earlier today. That U.S. unemployment rate is a really scary figure for multiple reasons.
Absolutely. When you look at the U.S. unemployment rate, came in for April at 14.7%. For me, even the scarier part of that is it came in below pre-report expectations. Many were thinking we'd be north of 15%. We haven't seen that level of unemployment here in the United States since the Great Depression. We saw over 20 million people who lost their jobs in April. It's certainly wiped out a lot of the job gains that we saw over the last decade. It does make me worry about what happens to the general economy as we get in the latter part of 2020. Just a little perspective, more current than the Great Depression, 07 to 09, that crisis period, the losses are roughly double in terms of what we faced, and we may not be done with that at this point. So it could be a long road back. To me, this all depends on how quickly, as we try to reopen the economy, we can get folks with jobs back and the economy starting to grow again.
Do we also watch as we start to see maybe more jobs and that job loss number shrink? What happens at the same time with domestic demand as it relates to, I think I get a little worried. We're talking about all of this unemployment, and we're also pairing it with potential rising meat prices and protein prices at the grocery store. That's really a bad combination all around.
It is, and one can certainly tell a pretty pessimistic story relative to domestic demand because of income loss and high prices. Again, I often kind of like to talk about, I see things happening in waves as we kind of uncover here. As restaurants open, and I should start by saying, I assume we'll continue to come out of this COVID-19 without a rebound in cases that would put us in some type of lockdown status again. But if that recovery continues, I see food service pulling here for a little bit, and I see that's filling the pipeline, as well as consumers saying, I'm ready to get out and enjoy a good meal at a restaurant. And so I think we could get some strong demand happening there, and then I think a lull could come. And that lull for me is maybe some higher retail prices, and that, hey, I don't have as much money in my pocket as I once did. Maybe I've already now spent all that stimulus check that I got from the federal government. So I worry about that period of time. And then maybe as we can get a little more economic recovery occurring, we start to get a pull again. So I don't want to suggest all is good once we start getting stronger demand. I think there's going to be fits and starts as we try to get the economy back going again. And how long that takes, I think none of us really know at this point.
There is going to be a lot for us to talk about over the coming weeks and months, most definitely.
There will be no shortage of topics, Megan, as we continue to try to figure out what this all means.
Scott, I think that'll do it for us this week as we look ahead to next week. A couple of big reports and a couple of things we're really going to want to keep an eye on, especially on that domestic demand side.
Yeah, absolutely. So USDA is going to give us another shot of their WASDE report. It will be interesting to see what they have to say for May. Of course, all of us are trying to figure out that crystal ball in terms of where things head. So it'll be good to see what USDA is thinking in the WASDE report. We also next week will get retail prices out on Tuesday, and then we'll finish the week with consumer sentiment. And we'll see what consumers are thinking about. I have a hunch it will not be a positive report that we get out next week in terms of consumer sentiment, but we'll wait and see.
All right, Scott, we will see you next Friday, but we will also see you Wednesday evening. We'll be back with another webinar focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on the agriculture sector. We're going to take a look and get an update on the beef sector, and we'll be joined by Daryl Peel and Corbett Wall. So we will see everybody then Wednesday evening.
That's great, Megan. Have a great weekend. Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you. And happy Mother's Day to all of you out there as well. All right, to have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can submit questions and comments there as well. For market updates twice daily, check out John Perkins Market Minute and check out all of the great Brownfield podcasts available online at brownfieldagnews.com/podcast. Have a great weekend. Happy Mother's Day. We will talk to you next Friday. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.